Stand in a field in eastern Anatolia 5,000 years ago. In your fist is a stone chipped to a point, the finest thing you own. The man opposite holds something you have no word for. Long, thin, catching the sun the way rock never can. Your body knows anyway. He can touch you before you can touch him, and when the edges meet, yours is the one that breaks. That moment, stone against metal, is one of the deepest fractures in how human beings have fought ever since. And nobody planned it. It began with someone discovering that a rock could be made to run like water. So how do you get from a sharpened pebble to folded steel? 5,000 years, 3 continents, at least 4 traditions that never compared notes. And it starts with the one thing stone could not do. For about 2.5 million years, every cutting-edge humans owned came out of rock. Flint, chunt, obsidian, superb material, volcanic glass fractures to an edge roughly 3 nanometers wide, against something like 25,000 for a modern surgical scalpel. So why replace it? Because rock is brittle. Stretch it long and slim and it snaps. A flint dagger exists, a flint sword cannot, and reach decides fights. Whoever holds the longer weapon owns the ground between 2 bodies. For millions of years, the material itself refused. Metal agreed. About 9,000 years ago, people across the Near East began hammering native copper into ornaments and small tools. Too soft to hold an edge, but heat moved it, melt it, pour it into a mold, and it froze into forms no rock would tolerate. Then somebody, almost certainly by accident, stirred arsenic into copper. Chaudu. It held an edge. Which brings us to a mound in Malatya province, eastern Turkey. In the early 1980s, Professor Marcela Frangipane excavated Arslantepe and lifted 9 weapons from a ruined palace, 6 long daggers and 3 short swords in arsenical copper, blades of 45 to 60 centimeters, 3 inlaid with silver. Blade, guard, grip, pommel, the whole grammar of sword design, already finished, about 5,300 years ago. Historians had placed the first swords near 1500 BCE. Arslantepe pushed that line back more than 15 centuries. Arsenical copper still makes a mediocre sword. Soft metal bends, and a blade that folds mid-fight is the kind of problem that buries you. Tin fixed it. Roughly 10% tin in copper gives bronze, harder, edge-holding, stiff enough to survive hitting something solid. Bronze turned the sword from an ornament into a real weapon. The Egyptian khopesh is the most recognizable one ever made, peaking in the New Kingdom between roughly 1570 and 1070 BCE. Its forward curve was functional. The hook snagged a shield and dragged it aside, opening the body behind it, devastating from a speeding chariot. 2 lay in Tutankhamun's tomb, emblems of a pharaoh's power. But bronze had a dependency written into its recipe. Copper was manageable. Tin is rare and scattered almost at random. The closest serious deposits to the ancient Near East lay in Cornwall in Iberia in Central Asia. British tin has surfaced in a wreck off the Israeli coast dated to 1300 BCE, a supply line running from mines in southwest England to forges at the far end of the Mediterranean so that men could be armed. Then the system fell apart. Around 1200 BCE, disasters stacked across the eastern Mediterranean, drought, ruined trade, revolt, and the sea peoples, seaborne raiders whose identity is still argued over. Ugarit, a hinge of the tin trade, burned between 1190 and 1180 BCE. No tin, no bronze, no army. Here's what most people get backwards about what followed. Iron didn't win by being better. Early iron was often inferior to good bronze, softer, more stubborn to work, quicker to rust. Iron won because its ore turns up almost everywhere. No caravan from Cornwall required. In the Bronze Age, swords belonged to a warrior elite who could afford exotic materials and expert smiths, while the farmers who made up nearly everyone still fought with wood and stone. War was a rich man's property. Iron ended that permanently. Arm everyone and armies swell. Wars turn uglier. The famous champion with his costly blade shrinks, and ranks of ordinary men decide the day. Not because the tool improved, but because more hands can hold one. And while we're on iron, in 1925, Howard Carter found 2 daggers tucked in Tutankhamun's linen. 1 gold, 1 iron. In 2016, researchers measured nickel at about 11% and cobalt at 0.6, the fingerprint of metal from space. Sky iron, the Egyptians called it. They took something that fell out of the heavens and made a knife for a dead king. Iron by itself is still too soft. Feed in a pinch of carbon, 0.5% up to 1.5, and you have steel, springy rather than glassy, sharp through a long fight. The trick is getting the carbon in. Southern India managed it first. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, smiths there were sealing ore and carbon-rich matter in clay pots and driving them past 1200 degrees Celsius. Out came crucible steel with a crystal structure that, forged well, printed visible patterns across the surface. Tamil called it uruku. Europeans mangled it into woots. Ingots traveled to Persia and Syria, where bladesmiths forged them into what the West would name Damascus swords, after the market where Europeans met them, not the land that made them. Those watermarks are neither painted nor engraved. They are the steel's own carbide banding. The method was essentially gone by 1750. Half a world away, Chinese metallurgists attacked the same puzzle differently. In 1965, archaeologists at Jingzhou, in Hubei, opened an almost airtight coffin and found a bronze sword, the weapon of Guzhan, king of Yue, who took the throne in 496 BCE. 25 centuries buried and untarnished. Tested, it sliced through 20 sheets of paper. The trick was 2 alloys in 1 blade. A copper-rich core that flexed instead of snapping, edges loaded with extra tin so they ran harder and sharper. So the sword isn't a single story. It's several, unfolding at once on separate continents, all circling the same stubborn question: how do you build an edge that cuts without chipping, survives impact, and still reaches far enough to keep a stranger's point off your neck? Rome answered with philosophy rather than chemistry. The gladius was short, 60 to 68 centimeters, almost comic beside Celtic blades built for sweeping cuts. Rome beat those men again and again with what amounted to a big kitchen knife because the gladius was never meant for duels. It was meant for formations, packed shield walls where there is nowhere to swing. What works is a quick point past the rim of your shield, a factory tool for killing at scale. And Rome hadn't invented it. The pattern came from Celtiberian warriors in Spain, whose short sword gave the gladius hispaniensis its name. Rome borrowed a blade and conquered the known world with it, including the grandchildren of the people it took the design from. Later, the fighting changed. More cavalry, enemies who wouldn't line up to be stabbed, so Rome adopted the spatha, shaped by the Germanic and Celtic longswords its legions had spent centuries facing. Every medieval European sword descends from it. Viking, Norman, Crusader. Trace the lineage back far enough and you land on a Roman weapon copied from Rome's enemies. Japan met the hard versus tough problem with the most laborious blade making ever devised. Mahogany, smelted in clay Tatara furnaces from charcoal and iron-bearing sand, came out with wildly uneven carbon. The famous folding wasn't mysticism, it was repair, evening out the carbon so no brittle pockets survived. Then differential hardening, clay painted thick along the spine, thin at the cutting edge, the whole thing plunged into water. The bare edge chilled fast and went glass hard. The insulated spine cooled slowly and stayed springy. Hard where it cuts, forgiving where it takes the shock. The boundary between those zones is the Haman, arguably the most admired detail on any weapon ever made. Masamune, Japan's greatest smith, forged the Honjo Masamune, a blade that came to stand for the Tokugawa shogunate itself. When the Second World War ended, it passed to an American serviceman. Then it was gone. Nobody has seen it since. In Europe, Vikings carried blades stamped ULF Barrate, 9th to 11th century, crucible steel so clean of slag that no European furnace of the era could have made it. The metal almost certainly came up the Volga corridor from Central Asia or the Islamic world. Ulfbert wasn't a man, it was a brand, stamped for over 200 years. And because the name sold, forgers copied it in cheap local iron, brittle enough to break mid-fight and kill whoever had paid for a sword he thought he could trust. One more myth worth killing. Medieval swords were not heavy. A standard one-handed blade weighed 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, about a laptop, precision instruments, and nobody was flailing. Masters wrote the systems down. Johannes Lichtenauer in Germany, Fiore de Liberi in Italy. Whole martial arts with name techniques and drilled footwork. And the groove down so many blades is a fuller. It has no connection to blood at all. It sheds weight while keeping the blade rigid, the very principle that holds up a skyscraper's steel frame. Then the sword died. Slowly, the way dominant technologies usually go, not beaten by a rival, just stranded as the world rearranged around it. Armor came first. By the late Middle Ages, steel plate was so good that a slashing blade barely troubled it, and smiths answered with thrusting weapons like the estoc, which had no cutting surface at all, a rigid spike for finding the seams. Then came massed pikes, shafts 15 to 18 feet long facing a hedge of steel points. A sword is dead weight. Long before firearms mattered, it had been demoted to a backup. The socket bayonet settled it. Every musket became a spear as well. George S.S. Patton designed what was arguably the last fighting sword any army took seriously. The Model 11913 cavalry saber, built to thrust rather than slash. And the final great saber charge came on 23 August 1942, when roughly 600 men of the Italian Savoia Cavalleria rode at Soviet positions near Izbushensky with sabers and grenades and overran 2,000 troops holding mortars and machine guns. They won. In 1942, it worked exactly one more time in a world that had already moved past it. A closing bracket on all of it, in June 2023, archaeologists at Nördlingen in Bavaria lifted a bronze sword from a grave holding 3 skeletons, a woman, a man, and a boy. Roughly 3,000 years old, its hilt octagonal bronze poured straight onto the finished blade by overlay casting, a method demanding extraordinary skill. Officials said it almost still shines. It carries no scars of combat, but its center of gravity says it was built to be used. 30 centuries underground, and in some basic sense, still ready. Tonight, somewhere, a sword hangs on a wall. Museum glass. An officer's dress uniform, polished, kept for ceremony rather than for use. It cuts nothing now. It doesn't need to. But the questions it was built to answer. How to deliver force beyond the length of your arm. How to focus destruction along one thin line. How to be rigid and flexible in the same object. Pushed forward metalworking, chemistry, trade routes across continents, fighting schools, even architecture, and shaped the power structure of almost every society that ever put one in a hand. A sword is just shaped metal. It's also 50 centuries of human ingenuity small enough to carry in a single fist. And the smiths in that Anatolian palace could not have imagined what they were setting loose. They only knew that rock shatters where metal merely bends, and that the man with more reach is the one who sees the morning.